Hello everyone, welcome back TV spoilers. Hayley's plan was built like a short, cute and efficient, quiet route meant to turn Bill into the past and transform her own future into the kind of power she believed she deserved. She chose poison tea not because it was complicated, but because it was smooth, something that could be disguised as habit, as care, as an intimate moment that wouldn't immediately trigger suspicion. In Hayley's mind, every detail had been rehearsed until it felt automatic. She believed that once Bill finished that cup, the world would shift into place. And everything messy that came before, warnings, doubtful looks, relationships cracking at the edge, would be buried beneath an accident. That sounded plausible enough to survive scrutiny. But Genoa City has never moved according to anyone's confidence. When Bill remained alive, when the event that should have ended everything instead opened a new door of suspicion, Hayley didn't just fail in action, she failed in her faith that she could control reality. Her anger didn't explode loudly. It thickened, sharpened, turned cold, something precise enough to cut through every thought. The fact that Bill was still breathing meant every trace she'd left behind could be examined. Every sentence she'd ever spoken could be replayed, and most of all, she found herself standing too close to a cliff she'd been pretending didn't exist: prison, an attempted murder charge, and the permanent label of mastermind that would cling to her name long after the headlines died down. Hayley couldn't tolerate that feeling of helplessness. To her, Bill's survival wasn't simply an error, it was humiliation. As if the entire world were laughing at her calculations. Instead of retreating, she pushed deeper, and that moment exposed her true nature in this story. She no longer framed the plan as a desperate last resort or an accident that got out of hand. In her mind, it became an obligation she had to complete. She pressured Randy to act immediately because she understood time was the enemy. The longer this dragged on, the more chances there were for someone to connect scattered dots into a single line that pointed straight at her. Hayley didn't drive Randy forward with screaming theatrics, she used compressed force, urgency, vague threats, and an authoritarian certainty that Randy had already walked far enough beside her, that he no longer had the right to turn around. She wanted Randy to become her second hand, the person willing to do the dirt for her, so that if everything collapsed, she would still have a layer of protection, someone she could drag down with her. But Randy wasn't like Hayley in the one way that mattered most. Randy feared real consequences. At first, his involvement may have come from greed, from the illusion that he was standing beside the person who would win, or from the kind of weakness that lets a dangerous plan sound manageable when it's described in soft language. Yet when the poison tea failed and Bill stayed alive, the entire story changed color in front of Randy's eyes. It stopped being a reckless gamble he could step away from and became an attempted murder plot, with a visible chaperone that only needed the right person to tug the thread. Hayley's pressure made Randy hear a prison door slamming shut inside his imagination. He pictured interrogation rooms, evidence being unfolded, his own name stamped as accomplice simply because he'd stood too close to someone willing to kill. That fear wasn't abstract. It was specific enough that Randy began measuring every step, every call, every word, because he understood one small mistake could brand him for life. That was when the detail that frightened Hayley most began to hover over everything. The possibility of strange test results connected to Bill. Instead of calming her, it tightened her panic because it opened two dangerous doors at once. If tests revealed something abnormal in Bill's system, the next question would rise instantly: how, who, and why. The moment medicine spoke, the story lost its blur and gained the sharp edge of proof. Hayley understood that in a world where lab results speak for themselves, her explanations would struggle to survive. She became faster, harsher, more desperate to force Randy into being the solution. But what she refused to see or chose not to see was that every time she pushed Randy one step farther away from her side. Randy began thinking in terms of survival. This was the moment where conscience and selfishness collided in a brutal, uncomfortable tug of war. He wasn't a hero and he wasn't entirely numb. He knew he'd gotten dirty, and that awareness made him disgusted with himself. But his fear of being buried under legal consequences was greater. In the nights when even traffic outside made him flinch, Randy reached a decision that was pure instinct. If only one person could escape, it had to be him. And if he wanted out, he needed the one thing the legal system always trades in: information for immunity. Randy secretly contacted Bill's investigator or the police, not because he suddenly became righteous, but because he needed a ticket off a ship that was starting to sink. The price of that ticket was Hayley. The moment Randy offered cooperation, the rhythm of everything shifted. The most dangerous thing in any conspiracy isn't an enemy outside the circle, it's someone inside deciding to turn. Randy demanded full immunity, and the insistence on full showed he understood exactly what he needed, not a vague promise. That could be revised later, not temporary leniency, but a legal wall between him and Hayley. He wanted to be clean enough to keep breathing after the fallout. He wanted to be able to say, when the story exploded, that he helped, that he handed it over, that he chose truth. But even as his mind justified it, part of him felt something rotting. Because betrayal always leaves a residue, no matter how official the paperwork looks. With Randy's cooperation, Bill or the police began gathering evidence quietly. Quietly was essential because the more pressure Hayley felt, the more reckless she could become. And someone cornered by desperation can destroy evidence faster than anyone expects. No one wanted to alert her before the trap was fully closed. Every move had to be light as breath, tracking patterns, logging contacts, waiting for the kind of slip that turns suspicion into a case. In the process, Randy was forced into a role he hated but couldn't refuse, guide for the opposing side. He became witness, bait, and mirror reflecting Hayley's true nature back at her. The worst part was that to save himself, Randy had to sink deeper. He had to keep reaching out, keep engaging, keep making Hayley believe he was still loyal, still on her side. Each interaction twisted Randy's stomach because he knew if Hayley sensed the change, everything could reverse in an instant. Randy arranged a meeting designed to make Hayley reveal the plan in her own words because nothing hits harder than a confession pulled out at the right angle. He didn't need to create new events or invent new bait. He only needed to steer Hayley toward the thoughts she already carried. The ones she couldn't help repeating when she believed she had the right to command. And the certainty that no one would dare resist her. Hayley, tense from Bill's survival and convinced time was running out, was vulnerable to her own dangerous confidence. She could speak about how the poison tea failed, about why immediate action was necessary, about how Randy had to do it now to finish the job. Each phrase became another brick sealing her exit. And the tragedy was that Hayley didn't realize she was building her prison with her own impatience. To her, it was simply the only way to reclaim control. To those collecting evidence, it was a gift. Once the evidence was secured, the exposure came down like a clean blade. Hayley faced severe legal consequences not because she lacked intelligence, but because she trusted too completely in her ability to manipulate other people trusted. That loyalty could be purchased through fear, and believed she would always be the one holding the knife without ever being cut. The shock wasn't only in being caught. It was in learning that the person pulling the curtain down was Randy, the man she'd pressured, used as a tool, and assumed would follow her to the end. Randy's betrayal turned Hayley's failure into total collapse. Because if even Randy turned, Hayley understood she'd lost control not just of the plan, but of the people she thought she owned. The case sent a shockwave through everything around her, not only because of the criminal stakes, but because Hayley's reputation shattered precisely in the places she once relied on to survive. In a town where the past always finds its way back and powerful families treat trust like a fragile currency, Hayley's exposure turned her into a living warning. Appearances are just paint, and one wrong decision can trigger a chain reaction of ruin. Her relationships suffered immediate impact. No speeches needed, no dramatic confrontations required. A single look could do the work. People would see her as someone who crossed a line, and once that line is crossed, it's nearly impossible to return to normal. Hayley might have believed winning was all that mattered. Now she had to face the truth that a victory bought through poison always carries a price. No one else can pay for you. Randy, meanwhile, was granted immunity, but he didn't truly escape. Immunity is paper. It doesn't erase sleepless nights or the feeling that he sold a piece of his soul for air. He could tell himself he acted out of fear, that he was only saving himself, that Hayley was the real mastermind, and all of that might be true. But truth is not always enough to make a person feel clean. Randy would keep remembering Hayley's eyes in the instant she realized she'd been abandoned by the man she assumed was loyal. And Randy's deepest fear wouldn't be guilt alone, it would be the question of whether he was actually safe, or simply waiting for the day another mistake drags him back into the mud. And Bill, the man who should have become a silent victim, stood in a strange position shaped by survival. He lived, but survival can be the beginning of questions even more ruthless than death. The poison tea's failure opened a new shadow, where those strange test results were no longer just proof of attempted poisoning, but a key that could lead somewhere nobody wanted to name. Because if those results didn't simply confirm what Hayley tried to do, but hinted at something that didn't fit the expected pattern, then the coming courtroom battle might not be the place where Hayley is sentenced at it. Might be the place where an even darker truth rises at the last second, threatening to flip the entire game just when everyone thinks the ending is already written. Hayley entered the most dangerous phase of her scheme not when she started it, but when she realized she could no longer end it the way she'd imagined. The failed attempt to eliminate Bill didn't just ruin a calculation, it shattered the sense of control Hayley had been clinging to like a final life raft in the undercurrents of Genoa City. Bill's survival became an alarm hanging over her head every minute of every day, dragging behind it the threat of being traced, suspected, and exposed. And just as Hayley tried to convince herself that everything was still within reach, reality turned cruel and reminded her that in this town, failure never stands still, it spreads. It sticks to reputations, bleeds into relationships, and clings to the smallest details until it becomes a verdict that doesn't even need to be spoken aloud. The pressure grew even more suffocating as Donnie became increasingly close to Bill, as if the universe itself were pushing Hayley into the darkest corner, threatened not only by the law, but crushed by the feeling of being replaced, edged out of a position she believed was hers. Donnie's closeness to Bill didn't have to be loud or public. It only had to exist for Hayley to feel the pressure tighten like a loop around her chest, making every breath taste faintly of panic. In that wire-tight state, Hayley became easier to pull, to provoke, to shove. Her con artist friend hovered like a familiar shadow of bad choices that still knew exactly what to say. This person didn't need fists or blunt threats. All it took was a steady drip of cold logic. If you've slipped, you have to take another step so you don't fall. If a piece has surfaced, you must act harder to wipe out the rest. If Bill is still alive, then the mistake was hesitation, weakness, useless mercy. Those relentless nudges hit Hayley at her weakest point, their terror of being seen as a failure. Hayley could never stand losing, and she could stand it even less if others witnessed her losing. So every time that friend pushed her toward a bolder move, Hayley didn't just hear it with her ears. She heard it through her pride, her desperation, her compressed rage. She started to believe she had only one option left, more extreme, faster, more final. Yet the more she tried to look decisive, the more her inner world cracked. Because deep down Hayley understood a truth she was terrified to name. If she crossed the line again, there would be no way back. The boundary between a bad plan and an unforgivable crime became thin as paper, and she was standing right on its edge, shaking, but still forcing her face into something that resembled calm. It was in that moment that Hayley began craving something she rarely allowed herself to need. A place to spill everything, a person to lean on, a brief second to be heard without judgment. When pressure is trapped too long, people either explode or collapse. Hayley didn't explode in any obvious way. She collapsed quietly in dragged-out nights, in the feeling of loneliness so sharp that even her heartbeat sounded like an accusation. And by instinct, she didn't reach for the people closest to her, didn't turn to anyone strongly connected to Bill or Donnie because that felt too dangerous. She chose a relative with minimal ties, someone Hayley believed could listen like a confession, keep it as a family secret, ask no questions, trade no information. On the surface, the choice looked like softness. In truth, it was the consequence of being suffocated. Hayley needed to speak or she would lose her mind. She needed someone to carry a fraction of the weight that was crushing her. Because if she kept holding it alone, she would destroy herself long before any detective ever touched her. The meeting unfolded in an atmosphere where even silence seemed suspicious. Hayley walked in like someone fleeing a storm. Her clothes may have been neat, but inside she was torn. She carried the fear of discovery like a bag of ice pressed against her ribs. And when the door closed, she felt as if she'd temporarily locked the world outside. She started speaking cautiously, still circling the truth, still trying to protect her pride, still searching for a way to turn details into something explainable. But the pressure had been building for too long, and the fact that Bill was still alive while Donnie's presence in his life seemed to grow sharper. By the day came a nail driven into Hayley's mind. Under the weight of failure and the fear of being unmasked, Hayley slid from excuses into admissions. She confessed the entire plot, the attempt to harm Bill, the financial desperation that had driven her into a corner, the rationalization she repeated to herself about protecting her future, and the moments when she knew she was wrong but kept going because she couldn't bear losing. Her confession didn't come out like a speech. It came out like a wound being torn open, so painful she couldn't stop halfway. And in that moment, Hayley felt something like release. Relief washed over her like rain after drought, not because the guilt vanished, but because she no longer had to listen to it echo alone inside her skull. She believed the relative in front of her would become an anchor, a stabilizing force, someone who could help her see clearly and find a way through the chaos. That belief is what made the tragedy so bitter. Hayley had no idea that in the room she thought was safe, a hidden device had already been placed, quietly capturing every word, every breath, every slip where her true self showed through. The private conversation she risked with her vulnerability had been recorded without her knowledge. The most frightening part was that the device didn't need to do anything in real time. It only had to exist and function, preserve the truth. The presence of that hidden recorder turned the story colder, because it suggested an unseen hand working behind the scenes. The person responsible for the surveillance had complicated motives beyond simple curiosity or petty cruelty. It could be about protecting Bill from further danger. It could be about exposing Hayley before her spiral became irreversible. In Genoa City, protection is not always gentle. It often means control, neutralizing threats, keeping a powerful figure from being dragged into deeper mud. And exposure is not always pure justice either. It can be revenge, strategy, or a way to hold the upper hand in a war of status and survival. Hayley couldn't see those layers in that moment, because she was focused on her own temporary relief, and that relief made her most vulnerable of all. That recording became ironclad evidence in the very way Hayley never anticipated. It didn't rely on guesses or shaky testimony. It couldn't be easily twisted by argument. It was her own voice, her own breathing. The kind of detail only the person inside the plot could reveal. It became a trump card stored in someone else's hand, waiting for the perfect moment to be played, not to warn, but to end her. And the terror of waiting to be exposed lies in its suspended cruelty. Hayley could still walk, still smile, still attempt to repair the damage. But everything she did from that moment forward could be made meaningless the instant that audio surfaced. There is a particular kind of trap people set for themselves without realizing it. And Hayley stepped right into it. She believed confession was freedom, when it was actually the moment she handed someone else the sharpest weapon possible. After the conversation, Hayley left with an almost unreal sense that she'd shed some of the weight. She could tell herself she'd at least spoken the truth, that she'd at least been honest with a family member, that she'd at least retained one human fragment of herself amid the chaos. But that relief was dangerous precisely because it made her careless at the moment. She most needed caution. When people finally exhale after being strangled by fear, they want to believe the danger has passed. Hayley didn't know she'd just laid her own trapnet through her next action, but through the words she'd already spoken. The cruelest part was that she did it in the most honest and broken moment of her life, in an effort to be saved, only to create the evidence that could destroy her. And when you place the storyline alongside the patterns the young and the restless has always loved, where secrets rarely die, where every crisis becomes a whirlpool that drags out the truth, Hayley's confession carries a very specific kind of weight. It isn't just guilt spoken aloud, it's the signal that she's beginning to lose control. In Genoa City, conspiracies don't collapse only because someone failed to plan. They collapse because human emotion eventually overflows. Hayley may have told herself she was acting from logic, from interest, from future security. But the moment she ran to a relative and confessed, she admitted the one thing she always denied: she was afraid, she was alone, and she was being hunted by her own choices. As I write this, I can't shake the chill that comes not from the cleverness of the scheme, but from how human it is. Anyone can understand what it feels like to be cornered, to need air, to need someone to listen. Yet that very humanity is what makes the tragedy so haunting. Hayley didn't fall only because of greed or hatred. She fell because she didn't know how to stop. Once she'd gone too far, and she didn't know how to accept failure without turning it into a crime. And what unsettles me most is the thought of that recording sitting somewhere, silent and unblinking like an eye, waiting for the exact moment to turn weakness into a sentence. What makes you want to keep watching isn't just how Hayley will be exposed, it's the moment that audio finally detonates, shattering whatever remains of her. And whether that brief relief she felt after confessing was actually the first sign that the real storm has only just begun. The Beyond the Gates CBS Spoilers channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the series from the perspective of a longtime fan. This allows viewers to gain deeper, more objective, and interesting insights. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the series.